welcome to the first of two informational sessions. Here to discuss the proposed bylaw change and dues proposal and process. I'd like to first thank the entire board of directors and staff for the hard work that's gone into this over the last 2 or 3 years, working on a proposed change that would meet the long-term interests of the association and Vermont credit unions. Let me quickly introduce myself and the board members. Sean Gammon, members of Vantage Community Credit Union. To my right is Susan Posabat, Granite Hills Credit Union, and Jim St. Peter from New England Federal Credit Union, Susan Best from Orlex Government Employees Credit Union, Bernie Isabel from Vermont Federal Credit Union, and participating via telephone with us today is Jeff Morse, River Valley Credit Union, and Bob Morgan is unable to attend today. Joe, in just a second, is going to start a PowerPoint presentation. He's going to go through in detail, and after that, we'll be available to answer questions and provide more clarity and detail and so forth. As I mentioned before, we spent quite a bit of time putting together a proposal that the 7 of us, along with the team here at the association, feel really good about. And we're represented by very small credit unions on the board and very large credit unions and everything in between, both from size and geographically. And we're excited to start this presentation off and look forward to your questions.
Momentarily. Okay, thank you, Chairman Sean. And thank you to everyone who has connected in this afternoon to our live stream broadcast. This is a bit of a first for us, so please bear with us as we go through and trying to conduct a meeting and presentation here. We've done educational sessions before, but that's just one person and one PowerPoint presentation that they bring along, so this is a little bit different for us, having multiple speakers and microphones and whatnot. So if there's a few glitches along the way, please bear with us. A few housekeeping thoughts before we get started. You're watching us on live stream, and I know a number of you are connected, and I should mention that with us in the room monitoring the connections and the comments is John Cody and also Brian Kent. Both are here helping us out with the streaming of our presentation and monitoring the chat feature and whatnot. And along the lines of the chat feature, you should feel free to ask questions or make comments at any point in time. You can do so on the right-hand side of your screen. If you haven't registered already, I think you need to create some kind of screen name. You can use your own name or your credit union name to put in there, and then your comments or question will appear and everybody will be able to see what they are. Folks in the room here, board members in particular, will read those to them at appropriate breaks in the conversation or at the conclusion, and we'll address each one of those in order in the order in which we receive them. You also can control the quality of the video feed in the lower right-hand corner, much like you do when you watch maybe a YouTube presentation or something. So we are broadcasting in high definition. If you want to see every sordid little detail of our faces here, you can do so by clicking on that HD button in the lower right-hand corner or changing it to HD. There's also a volume control down there too, so if we sound a little soft, make sure you check that volume slider, and also the one on your computer in the taskbar in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. A lot of work, as Chairman Sean mentioned, has gone into this whole dues study and proposal for quite some time now. And so I want to thank and commend the Board of Directors for all the hard work and thoughtful process they put into this. The proposal that was sent out to the CEO of each member credit union in Vermont some time ago did not come overnight. It did not come easily. And it came only after a lot of research, a lot of comparison with other state credit union leagues and other kinds of trade associations, and weighing a lot of pros and cons, looking at a lot of different formulas. And in the end, our 7-member board of directors, as Sean referenced, settled on this particular approach, thinking it the best for a number of reasons. And as was mentioned, we've got this little PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go through. Probably repeats a number of the things that you already know if you read the material that we sent out. But on the chance that some of our viewers haven't seen that, we want to review the basics for you here. So if you see me looking back and forth, it's because I'm trying to flip back and forth between camera shots and our PowerPoint presentation. And so here we go with our PowerPoint. The proposed bylaw amendment, and Brian, you're going to be advancing it as I go along here in the room for board members, right? So let me give you some background on our proposed bylaw amendment. It's been about a decade since the last update to the association's funding formula. And like all trade associations, our primary means of funding on the advocacy side, the trade association side, which is our primary reason for being, is dues. There's a modest amount of revenue that comes in from time to time from educational purposes and once in a while a minor subscription of some sort, but 99% of it is dues on the trade association side. Much has changed over those 10 years, and we've had other dues revisions in the past, going back over my 35 years or so here. But the most recent one was 10 years ago, and even in that short period of time, a lot of things have changed. First, we have fewer credit unions, no surprise. I think by national standards, across the country, we're still losing about a credit union a day to merger, or hopefully not closures, but mostly mergers. In Vermont, we haven't seen quite that many, but a lot of changes since the time that I started, when we had 72 credit unions, and today we have 25 credit unions in the state of Vermont. And of course, all of those credit unions that are remaining have grown larger. In Vermont, credit unions range from about $500,000 in assets today for the smallest one to near to $1 billion and everything in between. And the legislative, regulatory, and consumer environment in which we operate certainly has changed a lot. And just by virtue of the fact that you see now we're in a tax battle of sorts in Washington, and at the end of the last legislative session in Montpelier, there were calls for taxation even here in our own state house by the Banker Association, piggybacking, no doubt, on the federal efforts that were going on. And all of that comes about because credit unions have become a bigger target. Even though credit unions are only 6% of the marketplace, they've pretty much always been 6% of the marketplace nationwide, more like 14% of Vermont. Still, they've drawn a lot more attention. And you know that not a week goes by that we don't see some favorable press coverage or report about some favorable press coverage about credit unions nationwide and credit union systems and the advantage of moving your money from a bank to a credit union and so on and so forth. You know that, you see all that. And all of that draws a lot more attention to credit unions from our opponents in the banking industry and other sectors too. Just the cost of living, of maintaining a trade association, your credit union, and professional office of any type, and doing our advocacy efforts costs more today than it did 10 years ago. Our board has been bantering this issue of dues and our current dues formula around for a number of years now. This is not something that they just took up last spring or last winter, but for a number of years now. We have an annual planning process with our board of directors. We talk about a lot of different issues and what to do with dues, particularly with regard to the mergers of credit unions that we've seen, one credit union a day nationwide for a number of years now. Brings it to the forefront, not just for the Association of Vermont Credit Unions, but for every credit union league in the country. Unlike past dues revision projects, where we may have appointed a committee when we had a lot more credit unions, we looked at our board of directors and said, hey, we have 7 credit unions represented on this board of directors, and they comprise credit unions from among the smallest, not the smallest, but among the smallest, to the largest credit union in Vermont. And they cover a geographical dispersion that goes to all different parts of the state, and they comprise credit unions that are single sponsor, community, all different types. So it was felt that the board of directors of 7, which is almost 1/3 of Vermont credit unions, represents them both, Vermont credit unions, well, both by number, by the size of credit unions, their dispersion, and so on. So we felt pretty good about using this board of directors as a working committee to study this dues process. And since they meet on a regular basis anyway, it was a built-in mechanism for them to be able to discuss this issue regularly. Our current formula, or old formula, is, as we're going to outline here, and for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's spelled out in our bylaws. We included that bylaw language in the proposed edits in the package that went out, and it goes like this. The old formula is based on assets as of September 30th, multiplied by a factor of 0.000325, which is hard-coded into those bylaws. That doesn't change. And it's been that way for the past 10 years. There's a minimum amount for any member of $500, and there's a cap hard-coded in the bylaw language of $15,000, but we also put in 10 years ago in the last revision a provision to adjust that cap by changes in CPI from year to year. So with those changes over the past 10 years, that cap is currently at $18,959, or it was for the beginning of 2013 anyway. So what's wrong with that dues formula? So here's the things that we've been discussing for a number of years now. First and foremost, 1/3 of all Vermont credit unions are at that cap of the $18,900. And I don't care what kind of trade association that you are, what kind of organization that you are, if 1/3 of your membership is at the cap, that's a lot. And in a structure like credit union trade associations have, where the dues is based on a sliding scale, somewhat relative to size in one way or another, 1/3 of them being at the cap is a very high percentage. The typical merger, and I mentioned a merger a day over the past few years nationwide, not so much in Vermont, but still when a merger does happen, it stands to reason that if 1/3 of your credit unions are at the cap, that when there is a merger of a credit union in a state like Vermont, chances are, and not just here but in most states, it's going to be in one of those capped credit unions. And that, in fact, is what happens most of the time here. So because the surviving credit union is at the cap, the credit union that's being merged away, whatever dues they were paying, large or small or anything in between, is going to disappear because that credit survivor is already at the cap. And that cap is reached at approximately $60 million in assets. So you can see, that a lot of credit unions are beyond $60 million in assets in Vermont, and yet everyone from $60 million on is at that cap. Hence the next bullet point here, credit unions of greatly differing size pay the same dues. And so, from 60 million on, once you get to that 60 million point, you're at the cap. It doesn't matter how much bigger you get after that. So in looking at all of this and consulting with the Economics and Research Department at CUNA, who works on credit union league formulas a lot, looking at other state credit union leagues, referencing a little bit from other state types of trade associations, we set some goals for ourselves. And the first was that any kind of cap that you have in a dues formula is bound to become outdated over time. Even with this CPI index, things happen in the marketplace, in the mix of your membership, the mix of credit unions in our case. The growth of credit unions is going to be faster, slower, mergers and so on and so forth. So those caps, even with the provisions for CPI adjustments, become outmoded over periods of time, certainly over a decade. We needed to address that merger situation because just the total loss of dues from a credit union that's merging into another credit union is of concern to all credit union related organizations that have that kind of due structure. We need to maintain some kind of equity between credit unions. There needs to be some kind of relation and a smooth transition from the smallest to the largest credit union. There needs to be some kind of effective, sensible transition there from up and down the scale in terms of what dues that they pay. Whatever we come up with, needs to allow for future growth. It needs to accommodate and account for the growth of credit unions, and it also needs to empower the association to have some degree of future growth, because after all, everybody's operating expenses, yours, ours, and everybody else's, increases with the economy year to year. It needs to be as simplistic as possible and understandable, and in going with the line of being simplistic, we want to minimize the amount of change to the bylaws, and more importantly, minimize the need for this board to go back to the membership and propose further changes down the road, because it's determined that some new formula that we adopted has become inadequate 5 years down the road or fewer. And there needs to be a transition provision. Any time that you change a dues formula in any kind of trade association or any kind of organization, in a dues structure like ours, in organizational membership trade associations like ours, not individual members, but organizations like credit unions, Any time that you change the dues formula from what it is, there's going to be changes in the members. And some are going to move up a little bit, some are going to move down a little bit. There's going to be a shifting around. And the only way to avoid that is if you do nothing more than take the existing formula and increase or modify the factor that I referenced, the 0.00325, move it to 0.000328 or something like that. But that doesn't address the shortcomings of the formula, the merger situation, the caps, and so on and so forth. So, you know, all of the dues formulas that we looked at, and there were a lot of them, they all involved some kind of change, and it was important to the 7-member board of directors to minimize the amount of change, and for what change there is, to have some kind of transition provision. And as importantly amongst all of this, the board's desire was not to seek more dues, but to ensure, as I already referenced, mostly because of mergers, that we don't see a loss of dues in the future, and that there's room for some growth that stays in line with the growth of credit unions. But the desire is not to increase the amount of dues that we collect more than beyond what you'd expect for reasonable growth from one year to the next to account for the economy and so on and so forth. So our new formula that has been proposed by the board looks like this. Follows a basic approach adopted by about 1/2 of other state credit union leagues so far. And it's based on, again, just like the current formula, assets as of September 30th. And you take the square root of those assets. And we've had some people ask about, well, why the square root? And, you know, over the years, prior to our existing formula, we had a number of other different kinds of formulas over my time here that were based on assets, based on a combination of assets and members. Some credit union leagues based it on net income, gross income, so on and so forth, and it's all over the place. And if you look at what used to be 50 state credit union leagues across the country, you'd get 50 different formulas out there, and they were just all over the place, and they still are in large part. But about half of those credit union leagues have migrated to a square root based formula because of its simplicity and because it provides a line for growth from smallest to largest, but that compresses it enough so that you don't have, you know, the largest credit union paying some ridiculous amount and the smallest credit union paying some equally ridiculous amount because it's so tiny. So the square root pulls the range of payments between credit unions together a little bit, but more importantly keeps them in a smooth line progressing from smallest to largest. Multiply that square root by a factor declared by the board of directors each year, probably in the fall during the budget process. And for purposes of this proposal, because they thought it important to give credit unions something to be expecting and looking forward, assuming passage of this bylaw amendment in 2014, they already declared an anticipated factor, of 1.1. So that means take the square root of the credit union's assets and multiply it by 1.1. And that's I'll call it raw dues, because there's more here. I had mentioned a transition period. And so during that transition period, we're looking at 2014 through 2017. And during that period of time, no member's dues should increase or decrease by more than 25% from the dues assessed for the prior year. So in 2014 and in the estimates that your credit union received that we sent out a while back of payments under this proposal in 2014, which you'd receive, say, in late December of this year sometime, for payment in the first 6 weeks of 2014. We'd calculate the dues according to the square root multiplied by that factor of 1.1 and ensure that it doesn't increase more than 25% nor decrease more than 25% over what was paid in 2013. Do that again in 2015, 16, and 17, 25 each year, 100%. So by the time we get to 2018, all credit unions are paying the square root of assets times whatever that factor is. And it's important to know that every credit, there's a safeguard here during that transition period, that every credit union can know that no matter where their dues is going, in no way, regardless of the factor that the board declares, in no way can their dues increase or decrease, vary more than 25% from what was paid the prior year. And in fact, most do not already. 2018 and beyond, it's the square root of the assets times the factor. Mergers. I had addressed mergers already, and so this is an important issue during that transition period. What happens if a merger takes place during those 4 years, 14 through 17? So the merger provision that the board has come up with only applies during that period of time, 14 through 17, and it says that if a merger takes place during those 4 years, that 25% cap over whatever the prior year's dues invoice was that I just referenced on the prior screen is waived. And that means that the surviving credit union's dues is equal to the square root of assets times the factor from the year of merger forward. Translation, all this means is that when a credit union merges in 2014 through 15, if they merge, a surviving credit union is just going to get to the square root calculation times the factor without any transition provision faster than other credit unions that are not merging. But in 2018, everybody's at that factor times the square root. The result of all of this in the short term is that we actually collect slightly less dues in 2014 by roughly about 4% or so. Of course, that's contingent upon actual growth of credit unions. We just used estimates, and we don't know if there'll be a merger between now and 2014, and a number of factors. But based on what we know today, about a 4% reduction in dues today to provide for longer-term benefit of dues keeping better pace with overall credit union growth, minimizing the effect of mergers we already talked about, allowing the board flexibility to address situations that may arise in the future. And that's an important thing to maybe elaborate on, that I don't think the board foresees a factor declared in 1 year of 1.1 and the next year having it be 5.6 or whatever ridiculous number you want to put out there. But if it is known that there's going to be a big knockdown, drag-out fight in the State House or in Congress requiring lots of financial resources beyond those that we have, the board would be equipped in the fall of the year to be able to address that without waiting a year to go through a bylaw amendment proposal and whatnot, and having it maybe not work out as well. Avoids frequent changes to the bylaws. Lastly, the process that we've already outlined in the material that we sent to you, just some dates for you to remember. October 16th is a repeat of this broadcast that you're watching right now. Obviously, different questions from different viewers and whatnot, but none of the information is going to change. The proposal that we sent out to you in the bylaw amendment is what it is, and so it remains that way. But for any new questions that people come up with, or if we have board meetings and there's comments or questions that stem from that, there's another opportunity to have discussion on 1016. 1025, and I sent a reminder of this out yesterday or earlier this week, I think. We need to have voting designees declared, and that's the deadline, 1025. And we're going to a slightly new mechanism where you indicate who your delegates and alternates are online, and that designation is good for now into the future, for as long as you want until you decide to change it. So no longer at our annual meeting or in advance of our annual meeting will we be asking you who you want to have as delegates and alternates. We'll send something out to credit unions saying, this is who we've got on record. If you want to change it, now's the time. November 6th is an actual special meeting of members, because although we're doing this electronically, bylaw amendments still do require a meeting and a vote of members. So we're going to do that electronically, just like we're doing this presentation. The meeting will actually take place in this location in the association office. Anybody, of course, is welcome to participate here, but we'll also make it available online. There will be whatever discussion needs to take place, but it will be a brief meeting. And then at the conclusion of that meeting from 11:06 to 11:12 will be online electronic voting. And how that's going to work is that each of the people that are designated to be able to vote for your credit union, whether it's one or two, are going to get an email with some special code or password of one sort or another, and a URL that they're going to go to. And they'll use their credentials to log on to that website, cast their vote, and once it's cast, it's done. They can't go back and change it. And that whole process is going to be monitored by our accounting firm of AM Peisch, And then on November 13th, we will reconvene the meeting, however briefly, possibly by telephone, because it will be so brief, and Peisch will convey the voting results, and there'll be adjournment. And that kind of summarizes, with a little bit of elaboration, all of what we've already sent out to folks. And so now, I think what we want to do is open it up for discussion and commentary by everyone that's watching, or anyone that's watching, as well as board members in the room here. So, John, do we have any comments or questions?
We have several questions. The first is from Jerry Cross. Is the Services Corp income included in the league's financial needs?
Sorry to put my arm in front of the camera to aim the microphone at John. So I'll take a stab at that, and then any board members can reply as well. The Services Corporation is a for-profit subsidiary of our trade association. Our trade association is a not-for-profit entity. So there are some tax issues and some legal issues that we have to contend with when we're moving money from one to the other. And we do, in fact, move money from one to the other, but it can't happen just happenstance. There needs to be some substantiation for it. And so the way that it works, and we're guided by our accounting firm on this, is that we have the Services Corporation pay a royalty to the trade association once a year for use of its name and so on and so forth. The trade association does have to pay taxes, full taxes, federal and state, on those dollars. There are certain things that we do in the trade association that I guess I would say, I hesitate to use the word subsidized, but I can't think of a better one. Subsidized some of the advocacy efforts of the trade association, and that includes most of the, every time there's an election in Vermont every 2 years, most of the dollars that we contribute come from the Services Corporation to fund campaigns of those people that are sympathetic to credit unions in the State House. Because we haven't drawn on credit unions, although state charter credit unions can make campaign contributions. They're not real excited to do so, and I don't blame them. And it's tough to get individuals to do that. So we're fortunate to be positioned to be able to make contributions from the profits of our Services Corporation where possible. We do rebates, come from the Services Corporation. We've done statewide advertising for a number of years. That comes from the Services Corporation. We funded that Economy of Me program after the federal grant expired from the Services Corporation, and a number of different efforts like that. And then in line with that, we do a time study once a year, quite an extensive one, about this time of year, where everybody has to track their hours, and we track copies on the copier, mileage traveled, travel expenses, so on and so forth, everything, telephone expense, internet expenses, so on and so forth. And it gets allocated between the two organizations so that we can put as much of that onto the Services Corp, which is a for-profit entity, partly to avoid taxation where possible. I shouldn't say avoid, to minimize taxation where possible. But reality is that we have to be fair. So if we're ever audited by the IRS, which did happen one time many years ago, we have to be able to substantiate whatever allocations that we do. So, any other comment? Any board members or no? Okay. Another question, John?
The next question addresses the rebate that you mentioned. How will the Service Corporation rebate play into this new structure and or the factor that is assessed?
Want to run that by me again?
How will the Services Corp rebate play into this new structure? And also asking and or the factor that is assessed. That's from Matt Lewandowski.
So the rebate that goes back to credit unions right now comes from the Services Corporation. So in part it is I guess I'll call it a tax-related measure. And it is calculated based on the dollars that are earned by the Services Corporation from the products and services that credit unions buy through that Services Corporation. So we go through this calculation, and Brian and Mary do a lot of work on this in the fall of each year, and take a look at all the business that is attributable to all of the credit unions in the state, and of course it varies from one credit union to the next. And the largest credit union does not necessarily generate the most revenue for us, nor does the smallest credit union necessarily generate the smallest. It just depends on what their individual volumes are and what types of business that they're doing and whatnot. And it runs the gamut from small to large. And so what happens is we come up with a correlation between those different dollars of revenue that we get from individual credit unions. It's spelled out in the letter that we send to credit unions. Thank you for participating in these, whatever number of programs it is. And we take all that revenue, and the board determines an amount that is going to rebate when we're doing the budget process to credit unions, and we send that back to credit for the end of the year, one for tax purposes for us, and two for getting it on the books for credit unions in that calendar year. And then we take that, whatever that amount is, and divvy it up by credit union according to their percentage of the revenues that are generated. Anything else? Any other comment on that? Anybody?
So I think our goal is each and every year to, not only when we're setting this factor, but also having discussions regarding a rebate, is to both minimize expenses to member credit unions and, as much as we can, minimize dues or provide a rebate, balance that between those two different avenues.
Okay, next question. Jerry Cross asked, would the yearly dues float up and down depending on advocacy needs?
So, if it's all right, Jerry, I'll comment on that first. You know, I'm not a board member. I work for the board, and you've been on the board, so you know how it works. I'm not going to speak for the board on that, but based on the discussion that's happened to date, I don't think it's the board's intent to want to see that factor, that 1.10, fluctuate arbitrarily or greatly from year to year or over time. My reference to the advocacy needs, it's entirely possible that in some year, particularly dependent upon what happens at a federal level with taxation, I think that, and I use taxation because it's the extreme example. Hopefully we never get to that point, and it's our job to try, as trade associations, federal and state, to try to protect us from ever getting to that point. But it's the extreme example, so it's easy to talk about. So if we had a federal tax battle, you can be sure there's going, win or lose, there's going to be a state level tax battle, not just in Vermont, but probably in almost all states. And something like that's going to cost a lot of dollars. When we did our rewrite of the credit union statute some years ago, that cost a lot of dollars. The bankers were really up in arms about that. And I see taxation as a much bigger issue because it's more targeted, it's more specific. Credit unions are much bigger these days, a much bigger target. And the bankers have a lot more angst about it. So I use that as an example of a situation where if we knew that we were going to have to embark on a very large battle, it was going to cost us lots of money, I'm sure that the board of directors would look to our own financial resources first, but there's a limited supply of those financial resources. And all of those Services Corporation dollars that we have, as I said, we can't just use those for trade association purposes without substantiation and without tax effect. We do the best that we can at doing that, and as much as we can. But the advocacy side, it's a desire of our board to have advocacy kind of stand on its own as much as possible. And that's kind of a core reason for being for the trade association. I think, and board members, feel free to weigh in. I believe that we looked at our own resources first, and ensuring for the safety and soundness of the organization thereafter, look at that factor and see if it needs to be tweaked. But I don't foresee huge jumps in that factor.
Yeah, no, I think we all agree with you, Joe. Our intent and our hope is that it doesn't need to change much from year to year, that we create some level of stability with that. But it should be obvious, hopefully it's obvious to everybody, that by providing this factor in the formula, it does give us the ability and to make those changes from year to year. So it very well could go in either direction. It could go up substantially in 1 year, or could go down substantially, or a little bit in either direction. So that possibility exists. But again, our intent and our hope is to not have drastic changes from year to year.
The next question, Jerry Cross asks, states the formula gives full authority to the board for dues by way of the factor assigned each year. Will the board share with all credit unions the rationale of future increases?
Feel free anybody to jump in, but I think certainly all of us are always available. If people have questions about any decisions we make, certainly ask us. If we're not doing what's in the best interest of Vermont credit unions, we need to know about it. So if there's ever a question about why the factor was such, please let us know, and of course we'll answer that best we can.
I think your comments, Joe, earlier at the beginning of the session today, the fact that the 7 of us represent a pretty good cross-representation of the credit unions in the state, from smallest to largest. We all have a vested interest in managing the budget of the association, and so I think we'll be very prudent in managing to that minimal increase when we can.
I also think that you have to realize that the board represents either CEOs or senior officers of these credit unions, and we're obviously very cognizant of the financial situations that we have within our own credit unions in terms of trying to control our costs as much as possible. And remember, with as much flexibility as we can, the factor may have to change due to advocacy, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to look at other alternatives to help mitigate the negative impact of those increases, i.e. things as like the rebate, if we can do things like that. So it's not like the entire situation is going to be based on the advocacy assessment and that's it. We will, as much as possible, try to use other means to mitigate that.
So, if I may, I'll add a follow-up comment to that, and that's that, some years ago when I first started hearing about some other credit union leagues and other trade associations adopting some dues formula, funding formula that involves some board set component like this factor that we're talking about, my initial reaction was like probably some of the people watching or participating. When you first hear about it, that, oh my God, that's very trusting, to put, what your dues is going to be next year in the hands of a board of directors, as opposed to having it hard-coded in the bylaws like we have right now. Obviously, there are some shortcomings to our bylaws formula as stated right now. And, the changes in the marketplace and in credit union land are such that you can't foresee all of what's going to happen, whether it be advocacy, mergers, or general economy, or anything else. So I think that contributes to why we've seen so many state credit union leagues go to this kind of approach. And in fact, all of those leagues, as far as I know, have all gone to some kind of board-declared factor. Some of them have some different provisions for transition and caps and so on and so forth. But the basis for it is all the square root times some factor of one sort or another that varies by state, and is declared by the board of directors. And I think, at the risk of sounding crass, the bottom line is, if I were running a credit union, following up on what Jim and Bernie were saying, that the 7 people that are on this board of directors have a responsibility to their own credit unions and to other credit unions in the state, because that's who they represent. And just like, it's probably not a good week to be bringing this up, but just like the people that we sent to Congress, if you don't like what they're doing, then you vote otherwise. And the other thought is that, if they declare a factor that you think is unsupportable and so outlandish that you just can't support with it, then you do have the right to, make some decisions and make some considerations with your membership and whatnot. And I certainly don't want to see any credit unions not be members of the association because of that. But ultimately, it's the credit unions of Vermont that are going to vote on whether this proposal gets into our bylaws or not. And it's the credit unions of Vermont after that that are going to determine whether they're going to pay those dues or not. And this 7-member board representing 7 credit unions has vetted that process and gone through all of the different variations of it and whatnot, and as representatives of other Vermont credit unions come to a comfort level with this approach. And so the recommendation is, what you see.
The next question from Jerry Cross. If everything stayed status quo in terms of assets at the moment, how much more would this produce in additional dues by the end of the transition period?
Status quo.
If everything stayed status quo in terms of assets at the moment, how much more would this produce in additional dues by the end of the transition period?
Do you think that means no growth in credit unions?
I would say that's what we.
We didn't calculate it that way, we factored in
Yeah.
anticipated growth.
Right.
Let me use my shop as an example. Jerry, if you remember one of the slides that Joe put up, even with the factor of 1.1, the dues are actually overall for the association 4% approximately less than they were last year. And the transition period could take up to 4 years. Let me give you an example from my shop. You got to remember, the whole purpose of this is we're trying to make this as equitable and consistent for all members as possible. And in my particular case, because I'm one of the capped institutions that is no longer going to be capped, my dues go up between 14 and 15% the first year. Do I like that? Yeah, no, not really. But in the long run, with 6% growth, I'll use a factor that we did the calculation on. With a 6% annual growth in total assets, which isn't unrealistic historically, my dues, even with that 15% increase over the next 6 years, goes up 4.7%. Do I like that? No, but in the same token, I look at this. I'm not factoring in the rebate that I've gotten over the last couple of years, which would make that less. But just as importantly, I think we all have to ask ourselves the question. The purpose of these dues is primarily for advocacy, and I don't know about you, but even with the amount that I'm going to be spending, I don't think I could do that advocacy work myself as an individual credit union. It would cost me that significantly more than that from a legal perspective in terms of getting legal counsel. So that, coupled with all the other services that are being provided by the league, do I like the increase? No, but the new formula to me is more equitable to all of the credit unions, and if it means that my credit union has to pay more as part of that, so be it. It's in my opinion, it's the fair thing to do. And that's why the board voted unanimously on that, because they felt the same way.
I have a follow-up to that from Jerry. He says, I'm trying to find out how much more this produces, all things being equal.
So, if I understand correctly, going back to the prior question about if I'm correct in assuming assets didn't go anywhere. So, if we were, let me put it this way, and please comment in the chat box if I'm misunderstanding here. In order to do projections for individual credit unions for 2014, we had to make some assumptions, and so as Bernie referenced, we assumed 6% growth. That seemed reasonable on average, although of course not every credit union is going to do that. And we took assets as of 9/30. Actually, we didn't take 9/30. It was mid-year, 2014, right? That we did.
Well, no, we based it on whatever we had available to us.
Right.
So it was going to be the projections that we did with 630 assets of 2013
Right.
for 2014 dues, and then we extrapolated an average annual growth percentage of 6% each year.
So if we ratcheted this back and said, and I'm not sure if I'm understanding this correctly, Jerry, but if we had no growth in credit unions, if we applied this formula that we're proposing now to the same assets and mix of credit unions that we had in 2013 when we built 2013, right now, as Bernie pointed out, we'd be collecting what we're forecasting in 2014 with 6% growth from 13 to 14 to collect 4% less dues in 2014 than we did in 2013. If there had been no credit union growth from 13 to 14, we'd collect still less than that, something more than 4% reduction in dues. And I can't do the math in my head, but it'd be appreciably less, I believe.
I think it's important to consider that the factor that is the variable every year is the board's tool to manage the fact that we're not collecting too many dues or too few dues. We collect the dues that are necessary to fund the advocacy budget. So it's not like a runaway train kind of calculation. The factor is used to be able to throttle it so that it doesn't get out of balance.
But Jerry, if you're really interested in that number, that's something we looked at early on in the process, and just none of us have in front of us. We could tell you exactly what that number is today. Again, I'm not sure of the relevance, but we can get that number to you fairly easily.
A question from Jean Gaillard. Will the membership approve the budget, thereby authorizing the factor annually?
So I'll take a stab at that. The budget, just as in your credit union, is the board's domain, and so management puts together a budget, and has a budget committee comprised of board members, and makes recommendations to the board, and the board does, just as in your credit union, yay or nay, up or down, modifies it, whatever they choose to do with it, and we end up with a budget. And as part of that budget process, the board is going to determine, what they think, what they want to collect for dues, based on all the kinds of comments that you've heard already this afternoon, and translate that into a factor that generates that dollar amount. So the membership in our organization, nor in any other trade association I know, or ones that I deal with anyway, votes on the budget. If it did, that kind of is counterproductive to the approach that the board has selected of having the board have responsibility, as Jim was referencing, for throttling that factor from one year to the next, because they wouldn't be doing that anymore. It's the membership that would be doing that, and of course nobody's going to want to ever see an increase for any reason. So that would be challenging and kind of counterproductive to this kind of approach. If we wanted to have some kind of approach where the membership voted on the budget for the organization each year, I would recommend some completely different formula kind of approach than this, I would think, but I don't know. Anything else?
At this time, there aren't any more questions.
Any other comments, board members?
I would equate the answer to Gene's question to be something similar to what happens in every credit union. I mean, the membership elects the board to make the appropriate decisions, and the membership of credit unions has elected this board to hopefully act in a prudent fiscal manner. And as I said earlier, you've got representation of credit unions, whether they're senior officers, CEOs. I apologize, Sue's a board member, so you've got the whole gamut of representation on the boards. And with 7 representatives to the board out of 24 credit unions, I think we've got a pretty good representation. And bylaws are written to elect boards to be responsible. And I think there has to be some level of trust that the people that you've elected are working in your best interest along with the league's best interest, keeping longevity in mind.
Anything else, folks? Any other questions, John?
There are no other questions.
Okay. Any final closing comments from board members?
We really appreciate the participation and questions, and don't be afraid to ask questions between now and our second informational session. And we hope you participate in that one as well. And we look forward to your support with this.
So I get to do the closing housekeeping comments, and again, thank you from a staff perspective as well for participating in this broadcast. This is a first for us. We appreciate it. Let us know what you think of this process. We're going to archive this after we download the recording and clean up the beginning and end, because there was a lot of lead time at the beginning and whatnot. And we'll archive it on our YouTube channel for you to view or share with board members or whatever you want to do with it. And our next broadcast, I think the date that I referenced earlier is October 16th, also a Wednesday, but at 11 a.m. in the morning instead of 2 in the afternoon. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you should feel free to send them either to me or to any of the board members. My email is jgb@vcul.org. And feel free to send any questions. We're available to come meet with you, meet with your board if you want, or with you individually, talk by phone, email, whatever will be of assistance to you. With that, unless there's any other comments or questions, John, that concludes our broadcast for today. Thank you very much for watching.